who give job interviews, what are some subtle red flags that say, this person won't be a good hire? Story 1. When asked about their experience with a topic, they stick to reciting textbook definitions of terminology rather than demonstrating any understanding of how to apply it. Had one person who was literally forwarding our questions into ChatGPT and then reciting rambling answers that provided definitions of keywords in our questions rather than actually answering the question. Like we'd ask, what's something a previous employer or educator has recognized you for? And they'd answer, examples of things that an employer might recognize an employee for are. Story 2. I interviewed this lady, and she brought up how she had an issue with an old coworker, and at the end of it she said the coworker died of cancer. Of course I said, oh, I'm sorry, or something similar, and she responds with, she got what she deserved. Yeah, no thank you. Story 3. I once interviewed someone who told me she technically wasn't allowed to be in the building because someone on another floor had a restraining order against her. Story 4. My favorite story of red flags was when I screened resumes for a restaurant. A couple walked in dirty, disheveled, and reeking of weed, this is long before it was legal, and asked for applications. They were paper then. They popped at the bar to fill them out and the woman goes, babe, what's my zip code? I'm so high right now. Then about 5 minutes later, as they're handing the applications to me, the guy goes, hey, are we getting interviewed now? I got kids in the car. The woman interrupted, they're fine, they're in car seats. I was horrified it was January. Ran the papers up to the owner in her office, repeated both comments. She looks outside, jots down the plate number and called the local cops. When the cops got there, the two of them were trying to get free beers from the bar manager. I'm not sure what happened from there. When I clocked out, the cops had them outside and CPS was involved. So yeah. Don't come to apply for a job high, have an interview high, smelling and begging for booze while your toddlers wait in the car in the cold. Story 5. I was hiring someone with web development skills. Asked a candidate to tell me about a time they encountered a critical error and how they fixed it. Their response, well, I was on our website and noticed some information was out of date, a critical error. So I told the web development team we needed to update that critical error. Story 6. When interviewing people, I always try to find a way to subtly disagree or challenge one of their positions, whether I really disagree or not. And their reactions mostly fall in 3 categories. 1. They agree with me, Ian, take it as a learning opportunity, green flag. 2. They confidently back up their claim with supporting statements, very green flag. 3. They get defensive, territorial that I've challenged them, red flag. Story 7. Candidates submitted a take-home test by email. They forgot to excise the text of the email reply chain with their buddy, in which, if you scrolled far enough, you could see A. Their buddy helped them with the test. Actually, buddy did most of it. And B. The two of them weighing up the finer points of a drug deal they were participating in. Story 8. I work in politics and hire a lot of entry-level positions. With some firms, the only qualification is a pulse. In the screening call, pre-interview, I ask them about an issue that they care about. This is to first weed out anyone that doesn't have a clue what is going on, and also to weed out someone on the other side of the aisle. It very much is a partisan position. One person last year slipped up and somehow passed the screening call. In our office, there were cardboard cutouts of 3 prominent political figures, 2 presidents and a VP, all household names at this point. He got to the office, saw the cardboard cutouts, and asked who they were. Story 9. I can teach anything but giving A. If your interview doesn't show you give AE, it was a waste. Ask questions, people, like you are sincerely trying to determine what the role is and entails. Story 10. A guy I know that works in the IT industry told me when a girl he interviewed for a junior developer job had a complete meltdown and completely froze. The interview ended awkwardly, and that was that. A couple days later, the girl sent an email explaining she had issues with anxiety and asked for a second chance. Of course, my friend gave her that chance, she nailed it, and got hired. She now works as a product owner after 5 years with the company. Story 11. Due to the nature of roles I interview for, I often get people with PhDs and they split into 2 categories. I've done my homework and I'm ready to answer any question, good, and I am better than this job and you will give it to me, but I'll join the charade bad, like really fucking bad. Also, top tip. If you apply for an information specialist role, don't fudge your own information. We will do due diligence and we will understand whether you are trying to big yourself up, regardless of your background and nationality. Story 12. Showing up to the interview with a parent in tow. I've had this happen twice and both times I refused to go through with the interview. Grow up, people. You don't need mommy or daddy with you at your professional job interview. Story 13. I'm a mechanical engineer, and I have to interview candidates from time to time. In general, I give them a really simple technical question that I would expect a high schooler to solve. It's literally going to be things like, calculated the force on this object. The more you deviate away from force equals mass times acceleration, the more I know you are going to be a bad hire. Not only does it show a fundamental misunderstanding of the material at hand, it also shows me that when you don't know the answer, you're prone to taking up meeting time endlessly pointing out true but impossible to solve problems. Story 14. It's a really bad idea to be combative with the interviewer. I'm legit trying to help you succeed, and I make a concerted effort to make you feel at ease. If a question or request doesn't make sense to you, that's fine. Let's talk about it. If you answer defensively, bordering on aggression, it's really not going to go well. And you may get the answer right, but the question I'm asking myself is if I want to deal with you every day. Especially considering this was likely your best behavior. Story 15. Had 2 interviews for a software dev position this year that stood out. First one, the guy was well into the interview and going through the coding portion when the door opened behind him. A woman stepped in and asked something about reports and to wrap up what he was doing. When she left, he turned back to the screen and said he was sorry, but he had to go and ended the call. Second was a guy who was doing all right, but halfway through the interview, he just stopped responding to us. Call wasn't frozen. He just stopped talking, responding. Then the call just ended and we never heard anything from him again, even after reaching out to see if he had connection issues and wanted to reschedule. Story 16. Arrogance. Being unprepared for even minor questions. Not knowing what job role they applied to. Not being a good fit in general for the team. They like to work individually in a role that requires a lot of teamwork, etc. Story 17. I had a perfectly nice woman come in for an interview. Lied about her education. I knew because the diploma mill she listed quite famously doesn't exist anymore, but she said she was a current student set to graduate in 2 years. Honestly, if she hadn't lied, we would have hired her. But once I pointed that out in the post-game meeting, everyone lost any enthusiasm they had. Story 18. In IT, not asking any questions. An interview should go both ways. You should ask me about my company and team. Not only does it show interest, but it gives you information to make a decision. Story 19. When I call in a group to interview, I give simple instructions. Bring your ID, a pen, a piece of paper. 90% of the people who show fail to bring those 3 things and immediately get rejected. Can't follow simple instructions. Then why in the would I trust you with number 1000s of equipment on jobs where you could cost me tens of thousands? Story 20. He cried. Never had that happen before and threw me off. He was unemployed and really needed a job. He was not a good match for the job he applied for, but the recruiter and me gave him tips and tricks for the next interview. Hope he made it. Story 21. I once interviewed a woman that was chewing gum the entire time. I don't remember any of her answers because all I could think was, I can't believe she's chewing gum while talking. Had another lady interviewing for a personal assistant to company owner who said that we could not run a background check on her. Neither were hired. Story 22. Men that avoid eye contact or direct communication with women. Lots of men in my field, STEM, don't want to interact with women and will answer questions from female interviewers as though the man sitting next to her had asked it. I refuse to hire anyone with that BS attitude. Story 23. Most of these answers aren't subtle at all. An example of a subtle red flag in an interview is someone who can only provide examples of how they help the group achieve goals. If you give them lots of opportunity to talk about how they overcame challenges, dealt with unexpected results, had to adjust timelines, etc., and they can only give examples of how we solved the problem, I found that to be a red flag. You may initially think, this person seems to be a real team player and collaborates on everything. But my anecdotal experience with this type of employee is that they, more often than not, tend to be freeloaders who skate by just being in close proximity to the action, but not doing much themselves. As soon as you give them direct responsibility for an initiative, they don't know what to do, or they try to pawn it off on those around them under the guise of being collaborative. So my advice during an interview, make sure you explain exactly how you specifically took action to solve the issue. I don't care about the end state of your project. I care about the logic, drive, and responsibility you demonstrated in getting there. Story 24. I'd say not being aware of who you're applying to is a big red flag. I once worked for a local retailer in Maine, and at the time they did group interviews for potential employees. This was likely to see how well we'd be able to speak to customers and build team camaraderie. We had just gotten to the Q&A part of the interview, where everyone was asked the most lowball question of, "What do you love about the outdoors?" Well, this one older lady very loudly and proudly informed the room that she does not like going outside. She said it was full of animals and bugs, always got her shoes dirty, and she has everything she loves inside her house. We were applying for LL Bean, whose motto is literally be an outsider, so safe to say she didn't get hired. Story 25. I was in management for a daycare, and it became pretty easy to identify the red flags. Unfortunately, we were always so hurt for employees we'd hire them anyway. I know it's kind of a meme, but if you immediately let me know your sexual orientation, I knew it was going to bad. Like I had several candidates essentially open up with how they were gay, their race, and why their life was tough. Which I get it. We are in the South, it sucks. But like, how do you feel about changing diapers? And we'd hire them anyway, and they'd immediately get into it with a parent. Story 26. Subtle. He didn't have enough characters in his CCNA certificate number. Less subtle. I looked it up while his would-be boss asked him some softball questions. Once Cisco said it couldn't be found untracked, I asked him what was going on. "Oh, I'm working on it. Should have it in 6 months." Yeah, Cisco doesn't give a CCNA cert to someone that's still working to pass the test. Story 27. One of my weaknesses is I work too hard. Edit. Thank you all for the comments. I think this question is stupid and needs to be rephrased. When I get asked this question, I like to answer it by talking about self-improvement. Here's mine. If I come up on a problem, my first instinct is to dive right in and start figuring stuff out. Sometimes, this causes me to miss something. E.g. There is already a document that exists to solve the exact problem, and if I would have taken 5 minutes to stop, think, and utilize resources, I wouldn't be going in circles. Story 28. Had a management position open, and a quality applicant came in on time and was well-dressed for interview. Halfway through, we had a great interview, and I could sense he was already sure he had the job. His body language started changing, and he relaxed more and more, pushing back from the table and stretching his arms. Eventually, a full back stretch with a yawn. Then he proceeded to order pizza for his daughter and himself, so it would be there when he got home. He started discussing the commute and how much time he would have to dock from the workday for that. Shook his hand and never spoke to him again. Story 29. Oh, and so many people lie or exaggerate their experience on their resume. Then, when interviewed, they can't answer basic questions about key tasks in the role. Story 30. I've done a few interviews, and while not exactly subtle, you'll get passed over if you don't have an answer for a standard interview question. My workplace, like many large firms, interviews with pre-prepared questions and a scoring template in an effort to remove bias. If you don't have an answer, you get the minimum score for that section, which will often put you behind anyone that didn't bomb the interview. Folks, always have an example of how you've dealt with workplace conflict and problem you found and solved, and a project or task you saw through to completion with how you overcame some challenges. That's some basic stuff right there. Also, we have a standard question about the importance of DEI at the start of the interview, and everyone that said, "I don't see color," threw the panel right off. I understand that it can be said in good faith, but it's often a cover phrase for folks that don't really believe in the importance of diversity in the workplace by dismissing the benefits. Story 31. I used to host Zoom interviews for a bit. The amount of people who would be 10+ minutes late astounded me. It was an immediate no hire for me. If you can't open your laptop and click on a link on time, I don't trust you to show up to shifts on time. Bonus points for being late plus, obviously laying in bed. Story 32. They are wearing pajamas. I had to hire entry-level staff to work for an airline. Everything from checking people in to pushing wheelchairs and throwing luggage. Over the course of 2 weeks of hiring, I had 3 different people show up for interviews wearing their pajamas. One of them had a robe, a do-rag, and a beat-up stuffed animal and kept sucking on a pacifier. Needless to say, I didn't hire any of them, but to this day, I still don't get why they bothered to set up the appointment, take the time and effort to get there, get through security, etc., but didn't think it was important to put on actual clothing. Story 33. The same ones you look for when making friends. At the end of the day, this person will spend a third of their day or more at the job. That being said, super negative. They never do anything wrong or can't think of something they can improve. Trash-talking their former employer. Talking more than listening, cutting you off, etc. Story 34. I have a few. If they misspell my very common name in the cover letter. If they don't follow the clear rules on how to apply for the job. I had someone send their resume through an email change form for existing customers. IT said they hadn't realized that was even possible. The kicker was the first line of their letter is, they keep close attention to detail. Any mention of, they don't want me to waste their time. Story 35. I interviewed a girl that seemed okay. A little weird and quirky, but hey, we are all weird. Could have used some more experience in the field, but if we started her with low and she worked her way up, it probably would have been fine. Another manager took her to the facility, and I got a text from my supervisor to come outside to the parking lot area. He was standing behind this girl's car and did the quiet, loud whisper of, "Get over quick." I walk over and there is the largest bumper sticker that says, "I eat ass." My supervisor turned and looked at me and said, "You are not hiring her." Proceeds to walk away. Needless to say, with a facility that had kids around frequently, we did not hire her. I thought it was kind of funny. Maybe not something you publicly announce, though. True irony of it all, though, was the supervisor was was on Grindr all the time and had his lovers come to the facility. Guess he was a top and not a bottom. Story 36. Main and most common red flags are, they treat employees not related to their interview badly, i.e., being rude to reception, Josh admin, or HR staff who do checks on emails to confirm interviews. So many people will be rude to them and then act surprised when I phone them and tell them they have been rejected. Only once did I let someone interview after being rude to admin, and that was mainly because it was just so strange. They turned up at the office with their parents in tow because they didn't like they date. We offered for the interview and insisted we reschedule. After the first 3 interview questions, I had to end it and call a mental health crisis team because it was clear they were in the midst of a full-blown psychosis. So, they don't research the company they are applying to. So many people think they can sweet-talk their way through a full interview without knowing anything at all about the company. The red flag here, though, isn't that they don't know anything. It's that they made things up. They try to tell you what they know and get it very, very wrong. Even just admitting you don't know is better than getting caught out. You can sort of skate by and show an interest in wanting to learn more about the company and be honest about the little you do know. They avoid giving negatives about themselves completely. Even when I specifically narrow them down to the point and ask them to reflect on a weakness directly, they pick a positive trait and try to downplay it like a weakness. My experience interviewing hundreds of people tell me that this is just a variation of lying, and they are usually hiding some big flaws. No one is perfect. I specifically pick out people with weaknesses that we can manage and help them work on. For example, I hired someone who said they played off being a perfectionist as a negative, and boy were they right. The person couldn't keep up with the workload and eventually quit. But the other person I hired who said they had depression and had periods where they struggled with work-life balance was a great fit after giving them flexibility on hours. They were so grateful and happy to be part of a supportive employer, they worked twice as hard as anyone else. Overall, I've found that people who are very confident at interviews and those who generally score really well are what I call a 50-50 hire. Often they are the first to leave and take a better offer at a competitor, or have serious baggage, and are often much harder to read as they can talk themselves through an interview easily and hide their flaws or problems, which always come out eventually. I feel most comfortable and confident hiring people who are not perfect, but still have a willingness to develop and improve themselves. Usually, people in this range are very good at their jobs and just get nervous or struggle, giving themselves praise to strangers. In the end, the only real way to know is to test them out and see how they get on during probation. The main thing I'd say is, make sure you know what kind of person you're looking for, and that will guide your decision during interviews. Do you want someone who can hit the ground running and really competent and skilled, but may not last very long, or someone who you will likely see much more value out of in the long term with a bit of development? Story 37. Being a to admin staff. I always talk to my admin immediately after interviews to see how the applicant treated them. If you act condescending or short with our admins, you are pretty much off the list. Story 38. End of the interview. That up until this point actually went fairly well. Guy starts asking about the lads he'd be working with, pretty normal for construction, asks how the crew is, how long they've worked together. Then out of nowhere he asks who the biggest guy on the crew was. I didn't quite understand, so asked him to elaborate. He says he likes to be known as the biggest or toughest guy on site. Yeah, no thanks. Keep that drama off my work sites. Story 39. I don't know if it counts as subtle or not, but the dude had a bunch of porn star posters hanging up in his home office during the Zoom interview. I like as much as the next guy, but I don't want to see that when we're doing stand-ups. Maybe if he was Einstein or Tesla or something, but he couldn't even code his way out of a paper bag. Story 40. Anyone that leads. With how important it is that his or her boundaries need to be respected, is for sure going to be a pain in the to employ. Unless you're some rock star in your field, you should go into any interview with the assumption that there are 10 other people willing to work harder and for less. If you're comfortable enough walking away from the job, then you can hold out and demand more. But if you need the job, know that to distinguish yourself, the employer wants to see someone who is going to help him or her succeed. Story 41. Called someone up for a phone screening. I was asking her generally easy technical questions to see if she qualified to go through our interview process. She was whispering all her answers, and I could barely hear her, and I asked her to speak up, and she said she can't cause she's in a meeting at work. That's when I realized that the voice I kept hearing in the background wasn't a TV but a person speaking, giving a speech or something. I told her to try to reschedule with us. We ended up not having her in for an interview. Story 42. Intensely bitter about his divorce. Brought up his ex-wife a dozen times and his restraining order. Wasn't like she had any relationship with us. He was just angry venting. But a person who can't control their emotions in an interview is sure to be a problematic employee. Different one, let me know it was okay if he stole from us down the road because we have insurance for that. Yeah, no LOL. Arriving to the interview tweaking on a stimulant isn't a good look either. Story 43. Ignoring advice and hints. In tech, it's pretty common for there to be a dialogue between interviewer and interviewee when doing a difficult problem on the whiteboard. Some problems are actually designed, so you don't have enough info without asking questions. It's okay to struggle a little and need some guidance, but ignoring. That guidance is pretty much an instant no hire, even if your solution ends up being pretty close in the end. Why? Because we're not just testing your coding skills. We're testing your communication and how you work with teammates. If we hire you, the next time we work on a problem together, it might be one where neither of us just knows the answer. And in that situation, you need to be able to collaborate instead of just charging past to work on your own idea. Story 44. I'm not anyone who makes hiring decision, but I'm often invited to interviews to give feedback on candidates. Something that almost always kills the offer letter is negativity. We just had a fantastic candidate, but she found a way to complain about everything. The state she was from, too boring. The state we are in that she just moved to, too cold. Past jobs, too mundane, bad leadership, etc. Even some of her family members received jabs, currently living with sister who is too messy. She said everything with a smile on her face and was generally pleasant, but we couldn't get past the fact that she had something negative to say about everything. Doesn't really scream team player Sosh good fit. Story 45. If they no call, no show for an interview and then call me in a panic a day later. Nope. I've had plenty of candidates call before an interview to say they were running late or had an emergency. They were very ill and had to reschedule. No problem. Happens. You might be an awesome candidate on paper, but if the position is not important enough to you to double-check your calendar, the confirmation email, etc., then I don't want you. Maybe you had a brain, maybe you had a bad day, but who cares? We all do. Communication is the key. I'm not going to hold anyone's hand. Better luck next time. Story 46. I have a pair of questions that I usually ask in an interview. You worked with a team of other employees at your last job. How did you work together with them? And what were your processes for collaborating and interacting when needed? Followed by, it's common for teams to have a few members who are hard to work with. Tell me about how you've handled that with your previous teams. You'd be shocked at the number of people who will start absolutely shitting on their former coworkers when these questions come up. You'll notice that, with both of those questions, I wasn't asking about the former coworkers. I was asking the applicant about their own behavior and actions. And yet, given the opening, I've seen applicants just absolutely roast their former teammates time after time. It's a red flag, often indicating that the applicant will be adversarial if they're hired and placed onto one of our teams. Story 47. I've interviewed for entry-level jobs. Trust me, 8-10 interviewees are just hopeless, and you're praying someone with half a brain comes through the door. If you look like you've slept the previous night and had a shower since, you're already in the top half. Answer one question well, maybe even crack a smile to show you can be relaxed under pressure, you're in the top 3. Remember my name as you're leaving? You got the job. Story 48. Software engineer. I always keep asking questions until I find something they don't know. If they don't say, I don't know at that point, huge red flag. Nobody knows everything. Being able to recognize when you've encountered a subject outside of your knowledge is essential. Story 49. Guy gave my manager and I bro hugs before and after the interview. Laughed about it afterwards, but definitely not professional. Also, desperation gives off the worst vibe. I need this job, or I'll do anything, are things to never say. Story 50. Forgetting what position you're interviewing for. I was screening candidates for a teaching position that had opened up at our elementary school. When asked what had interested her in applying, the candidate said she was trying to get out of teaching because kids are so rude and difficult to manage these days. I had to remind her that not only had she applied for a teaching position, it was at a school that specialized in supporting students with complex behavioral disorders. Story 51. If they can't actually answer the questions. And I don't mean, I'm not sure, let me think about it. I mean, they give some rambling response that never actually answers the question. If they seem to have strong opinions about things that shouldn't be that big of a deal, they usually make bad coworkers. If they allude in any of their answers to anger issues. I hire a lot of entry level, and you'd be surprised by how many of them, when asked to tell me about a time there was a conflict at work, what they will admit to. If they can't use basic technology for the interview process. We are tech such software, CRM heavy. If they can't own mistakes. So when I ask about times there have been problems at work and they skate around their involvement instead of owning it. What I do look for: good work ethic, humility, emotional intelligence, ability to take constructive feedback. Story 52. When I asked about his hands-on experience, he was referring to the plural. I'd ask, how do you place a catheter? His response would be, first we would bring the patient out, then we'd prep the needle, etc. I'd ask, describe the process of which you take a blood draw. He'd say, the team would gather all the supplies, etc. It gave me the impression that he didn't have any hands-on experience but instead watched or assisted other people. Story 53. I work with animals for a living. I'm not the supervisor who is going to write you up for mistakes, but I do want you to be honest with me about mistakes because we're dealing with living creatures. So I ask what's a mistake you made and how did you rectify it? Question. Some people think it's a bad, unfair question, but I like it. I've had people tell me they've never made a mistake at work. Not really a subtle red flag. And then some people just say they never did it again for the rectify part. So you didn't tell anyone or do anything about it? Story 54. I think sometimes the most subtle red flag is gut feel, usually based on body language. I interviewed someone for a senior role a while back, and they answered everything fairly well. But when asked a question about a previous role, they had a slightly deranged, but subtle, eye twitch. Like they were triggered and wanted to say something negative but couldn't. Thought it was interesting at the time, but being under pressure to fill the role, I ignored it. Worst hire I'd ever made, by far. Alienated their team, went to war with everyone, constant arguments. I trust my gut feel nowadays. Story 55. Years ago, I was doing a rehire. The guy stated he had left the company to take care of his dad, who had terminal cancer. He was gone about 18 months. He refused to fill out an application and background check paperwork. He told me he didn't have to contest, just use his previous paperwork. This was for an aircraft mechanic position, so once you're gone for over 30 days, you have to reapply and get a fresh background check, drug screen, etc. He went to my boss, who he was friends with previously, and my boss said start the rehire process and he'd take care of HR. So, I get him started. Background check came back. He was in jail for that period of time and his father had passed away years ago. Needless to say, he didn't finish the rehire process. Story 56. I'm an Irish guy in Canada, and our talent acquisition manager also happens to be Irish. For whatever reason, my accent has become pretty diluted and more Canadian, whereas my colleague's accent has stayed very Irish. We had an applicant ask my colleague why he's so hard to understand, while I'm easier to understand, and then went on to mock his accent for the last 2 minutes of the interview. Not sure what she'd get out of insulting the accent of a person that's responsible for hiring her. Story 57. I once had a guy that when asked about his previous employment, he started on a tangent about how he made so much money on one of his freelance regular gigs and how important his previous positions were. You need not be an expert in recruiting, I am certainly not, to see his arrogance. My thoughts all the time I was speaking to him was, then why did you apply to an administrative position that pays nowhere near what you deserve? The job post was very clear on the salary. Story 58. Casually bringing up politically controversial topics during the interview. A lot of folks can't seem to help themselves. If they can't help themselves during an interview, they definitely can't keep things nonpartisan in the office and will be a catalyst for interpersonal problems. Story 59. I had an interview set up for a Monday morning for a woman that our HR dep met at a job fair. My employee let me know my interview was waiting in the lobby. I went to greet her. It was a man. Her husband came to do the interview for her. I did not hire them. Story 60. Had an interviewee show up 15 minutes late. He opened the door and stood there for about 2 minutes. I just kind of sat there wondering what was happening, and then an older woman walked in. He closed the door, and I got up to greet him. He introduced himself and then proceeded to introduce the older lady as his mom. Okay. Before I could even proceed with anything, he immediately asked if his mom could accompany him to the office since they were very close, and also if he could have Wednesdays and Thursdays off as it was D&D days with the boys. I didn't even offer to continue with the interview. I simply showed them both the door. Story 61. They're a felon. They were fired from the job before. They were sued in civil court for rape. They have no experience for the job they are applying. They were a reality TV star. They're over 75, and the job requires lots of travel and late nights. They spend more time golfing than working. Story 62. Some recent red flags. Extreme job hopping. I'm talking 6 jobs in less than 4 years, and all of them lateral or worse. His resume was not even up to date because he had quit his last job 2 months ago. He had a job. He had been working there for 2 months, and he was interviewing with us. Cover letter said he had 22 years of experience in our field. Cool, we like experience. He was 26, used someone else's cover letter. Amazingly, one of my fellow managers decided to hire him anyway. Turned out he lied on all of his experience. Asked them when they could start if offered the position. They said, today. They were employed. Yeah, if you will quit no notice on your current employer, you will do the same to me. We didn't offer. Dude had a big fancy watch that didn't work. At some point in the interview, I realized the second hand was not moving. Then I noticed the time was wrong. I became obsessed with his watch and after 5 minutes confirmed that it wasn't moving at all. It described him perfectly. All flash, no substance. I'll add one that could have been a red flag, but the person handled it brilliantly. Fellow manager asked about a gap in his resume. He said, I was doing landscaping. That's when I decided I didn't want to do landscaping anymore. Everyone in the room nodded. He got hired. Story 63. Interviewed a guy wearing gang colors once. It was easy to miss, not over the top, but I was a bit suspicious. After the interview, I told the recruitment agency to run a police report on him. They came back pretty soon. Yeah, nah, you definitely don't want this guy. Sasho. Story 64. I've done a lot of hiring for roles that require an employee to be both personable with customers and also able to work cohesively in a team setting. A question I like to ask people is, what is something most people don't realize or notice about you that you wish they would? You'll get a ton of answers, and it's always very interesting to see what people come up with. It makes people think critically about themselves, and specifically, makes them think critically about why they are good. In an interview setting, I've got a lot of the information I need in front of me in the form of a resume. So tell me, what isn't on here that you want me to know about? It's like someone's opportunity to humble brag, so to speak. I've gotten some great answers. One person told me, I've tried a lot of really difficult things. Okay, cool. You are comfortable being out of your comfort zone. That is good. I've also gotten an answer like, I'm not a fast learner, but I'm really good at being persistent. And my persistence pays off. So while it take a little longer, I always become an expert eventually. Another great answer. Now, the red flag here is when someone just can't think of anything. They go blank. That tells me they lack the ability to self-reflect and think critically about themselves. It tells me they'll be difficult to manage.